Good afternoon, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. Can I see a show of hands about how many people have served in one of our AmeriCorps programs? Gotta look. Yay! And how many of you have hosted AmeriCorps members? Okay, so a lot of you. Great to hear. So I'm here to talk to those of you who don't know anything about AmeriCorps and Senior Corps. This is such a great opportunity for me to talk to you about this and about how together as partners we can address some of the serious homelessness issues in this country. Poverty and its related challenges have been a stubborn foe for centuries. However, the courage and resilience of those who refuse to accept things as they are will be the ones who lead us toward the way things should be. I am so honored to lead the AmeriCorps Vista program that carries this idea close to its heart, just as all of you do. In addition to my role as director, I also represent our agency on the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness and the Coordinating Council on Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Prior to this, I was the chief of staff at our agency. From this lens, I've learned we need action, not words. As Nelson Mandela said, do not look the other way. Do not hesitate. Recognize that the world is hungry for action, not words. Act with courage and vision. That is what you do every day in your work, and that's what we would like to partner with you on. The mission of AmeriCorps and Senior Corps is to improve lives, to strengthen communities, and foster civic engagement through service and volunteering. We are the federal government agency that makes grants and promotes service opportunities and volunteerism all across the country. We do that by providing people power, especially at Vista, which of course I'm a little more attached to. But we provide people power and grants to nonprofits, to tribal communities, state and local governments, and educational institutions. Community organizations are the ones who know what their people need. They're the ones on the ground. And that's where AmeriCorps and Senior Corps come in to help strengthen these organizations by providing direct service, project development, volunteer recruitment and management, marketing and outreach, and partnership development. I'm sure those are all things that all of your organizations could use more of. That's how the resources of AmeriCorps and Senior Corps can help you build and strengthen your organization, the critical work of addressing homelessness in this country. They always tell me, and I'm sitting here with my new friend who will be speaking next on data, but they always tell me, don't put too many numbers in your speeches. I ignore that. I love numbers. Here is just a taste of what we accomplished in 2018. 130 foster grandparents projects provided mentoring and support to 2,193 homeless children. AmeriCorps and Senior Corps projects transitioned over 13,244 economically disadvantaged individuals, including individuals experiencing homelessness, into safe, healthy, and affordable housing. Our NCCC campus-based program for 18 to 24-year-olds built more than 230 houses and assisted 20,950 people experiencing homelessness. In AmeriCorps Vista, the program I lead, our Vista members strengthened and expanded more than 170 organizations around the country that work to prevent homelessness. And this is just what we do on the issue of homelessness. Vista, which is a legacy program, is one of our oldest programs. Volunteers in Service to America began in 1964 when the first class of 25 men and women answered the call to service as a part of President Johnson's War on Poverty. This first group ranged in age from 21 to 71, and that's still true today. I have a brigadier retired general working on food insecurity in Wyoming. So it is all ages that become Vista members. This first group worked very hard and had a common goal to help their fellow Americans break free from the shackles that dampened their hopes and dreams for a better life. The flexibility of AmeriCorps Vista program is a difference maker for large programs like Habitat for Humanity or the United Way, as well as smaller community-based programs that understand how grassroots solutions can change lives. I'm proud to be part of a team that believes in volunteering and solving vexing local and national community problems. But I'm not here just to talk about Vista, but rather all of our programs and the members all across our programs who prepare today's students for tomorrow's jobs, reduce crime, connect returning veterans to jobs, fight the opioid epidemic, make college more accessible and affordable, work to alleviate poverty, and help Americans rebuild their lives after a disaster. No question, their national service improves lives and expands opportunities, but not just for the communities being served, but also for those who serve. Serving in one of our programs builds leadership skills, teaches problem solving, exposes members to new and diverse communities, and so important in this day and age, fosters empathy that strengthens the fiber of our country. If you're interested in learning more about applying for our resources or applying to serve in one of our programs, please visit Beth Binkley, my colleague. She is out in the outer area where you can get drinks, and talk to her or to me after this speech. Thank you so much for all the work you do. It's truly a privilege to be here with you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be here. Just one quick note. So I'm actually a soccer player by background, so I made sure that I'm not responsible for throwing this box around. So we'll just have to figure out the logistics after I talk with you guys a little bit. But I think, again, one, very excited to be here. Just for context, I'm not at all a homelessness expert. I'm an affordable housing lawyer by training, but I work with folks who do big data. And I want to talk a bit about the research we do at Opportunity Insights, some trends in economic mobility and economic opportunity more broadly, and then talk around housing policy specifically, and I think ways that we can think around leveraging the research to impact issue areas like housing policy to make all of our work more effective and more impactful. And for a little bit of context, so my hometown is Detroit, Michigan, and before serving, I'm in the right crowd, all right. This is real. Actually, I wanted to have some Motown intro music, but I forgot to get that set up. So I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and actually worked in the mayor's office there for several years before serving at Opportunity Insights. And I actually joined the mayor's office the same year we were entering into the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history, right? So Detroit's a city that over the past 50 years lost over half its population, over 1 million people. And over the past 15 years, 1 in every 3 homes was lost through tax foreclosure, right? So impacting hundreds of thousands of families and children. But through some really hard work, working across sectors, collaborating with the business community, philanthropic community, nonprofit community, we really started to see progress. Less blight, less abandoned homes, better city services, And we started to see more investments coming into our neighborhoods. So we're seeing progress. But one thing that was always top of mind was that as we're seeing good things happening, are we really impacting the life outcomes of the most vulnerable families and their children? Right? Are these good things that are happening in the city really having the impact that we need and want for those families that most need it? And candidly, we didn't have the answer to that. Right? We didn't have the data to understand what was the true impact of all these policies and some of the progress that we were starting to see. And that's, in a sense, what animates the work for Opportunity Insights, is to use data and research to better understand policy, to better understand the issues, and hopefully work with policymakers and practitioners to ensure that all the work we're doing is as impactful as possible. And so I have some slides. That's my opening slide. But so kind of one question is, how do we better understand some of these issues? So, you mentioned that one of our goals is to help revive the American dream, an ambitious goal. But so what are the actual issues, right? How do we measure these different types of ideas, right? There's that assumption, that narrative that America is a country that no matter where you start, if you're a low-income kid, that as long as you work hard and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, right, anybody can achieve the American dream. But again, what does that really mean? So one way we try and measure that is, right, what's the chance that a kid who grows up in a low-income family ends up being a high-income adult? And so one thing we actually see in the data is that actually the American dream in some ways is very much alive and well, but unfortunately not necessarily in the US. Right? So, some of our colleague countries across the Atlantic in Europe, much higher chances of going from that bottom quintile, from that lowest 20% of income, to that highest income quintile. And even Canada almost has rates twice as high as the US. Right? So what's behind that, and what other trends can we explore? The other ideas of absolute mobility. The idea that if you work hard, you'll grow up to be more successful than your parents. So how do we measure that? So one thing we've done is, and I'll talk a lot about data and numbers, and hopefully I won't bore you given that I'm talking to you after lunch, but comparing the earnings of kids to their parents and seeing if that assumption of upward mobility, of prosperity, is still real, if that American dream is alive. And what we see is that for folks who were born in the 1940s, that assumption was almost a guarantee. So 90% of folks who were born in the 1940s grew up to earn more than their parents. But we've seen that has changed dramatically, and so much so that by the time you get to that 80s, that guarantee of upward mobility has become a coin flip. Right? There's a 50-50 shot whether or not you will grow up to earn more than your parents. And in some ways, we think that's at the core of a lot of the political and cultural frustration that we see today, that idea of upward mobility, of intergenerational advancement, of prosperity has become so fleeting for many. So again, we use big data to study economic mobility, understand the issues, and then really start to test out and analyze a broad range of potential policy interventions and programs. And some of our most recent research focuses on the impact of geography and the impact of place. So what we've done is we focus on kids who grow up in low-income families. And we use tax data to link those children to their parents so we know how much money their parents made while they were growing up. And then we can track using tax data and see their earnings in adulthood. And then we can figure out what the average is for kids who grew up in every census tract in the country. And we try and be open access to help spread knowledge about some of these issues. So all this information is actually available on a tool called the Opportunity Atlas. So opportunityatlas.org. You can go on your smartphones and actually look up your communities where you work and live and dive down into every individual census tract to understand what are the average outcomes for kids who grow up there. And when we see across the country, so we looked at comparing to other countries, we've seen trends across time. But what this shows us is the impact of geography. So the economic mobility looks very different in different places. You see these parts of the country, the Great Plains and the upper Midwest in deep blue. These are areas that have very high rates of upward mobility. where kids who grow up in low-income families, on average, grow up to earn upwards of $35,000 and $40,000, which is higher than any country we have data for. Whereas you look in the Rust Belt, in communities like Detroit and in the Southeast, these areas of deep red, places where kids who grow up in poverty, on average, stay in poverty. So thinking around what's happening in our communities, what's happening in these places that is creating these disparate and very different outcomes. And one issue at the core of a lot of these things is race. So this is the same chart looking at rates of upward mobility, but now we're comparing outcomes for black men compared to white men. And one thing to note is that these two maps are on the exact same color scale. And what that means is that the best places in terms of outcomes for black men are still worse than the worst places for white men. Right? So men growing up in the exact same communities, in the same cities, we actually see it in the same neighborhoods and even on the same city block, growing up in similarly low-income households are having very different outcomes just based on their race. And we see it very clearly in the data. Interestingly, we actually see a very different picture for black women compared to white women, where conditional on income, these women are actually growing up to have very similar incomes in adulthood. So in some ways, race is impacting black men in very unique and specific ways. And so much so that we also see it for black men growing up in high-income families. So this is the chart that the New York Times put together based on some of our data. And what it shows is that for white men who are represented by the green dots, they tend to float towards the top, which means that white men who grow up in high-income families generally grow up to become high-income adults. But we see this cascading effect for black men who are represented by those pink dots. And what it shows is that black men who grow up in high-income families are actually more likely to become low-income adults than to stay in that same income bracket. So I think it's really important that we think critically around all the work we do and how our communities, our programs, our processes are impacting different folks in different ways. And I think we can't forget about how just comprehensive race is and always has been in our culture and in our communities. But so one thing is, so we have the Opportunity Atlas. We saw those trends across regions of the country. We can also, as I mentioned, zoom into individual communities. So we're zooming into New York here. And the same differences in outcomes you see across regions, you see within cities and even across different neighborhoods. So again, we're zooming into New York. Actually, it was interesting, ICPH did a pretty cool case study of a neighborhood called Brownsville in Brooklyn. And so I wanted to pull up some information from that neighborhood specifically and dive into that. And one thing to note is that, we're a lab that does big data. I'm not an economist myself, and it's kind of my job to help translate a lot of this really complicated work into, I think, normal human terms, in terms we can actually use on the ground. And the data can help us pinpoint things happening, but it really takes real collaboration, right? Working with you all, folks who are doing this work on the ground, who understand what's happening in your communities and tying that to data to pull out those insights that hopefully can make us all more impactful. And so one thing, NPR did an actual story looking at some of our data to talk to local residents and figure out what was happening in Brownsville and some of these communities.
When people find out where Audra Palacio is from, they often react in disbelief.
Wow, how could you come from there and you live there? And it's like, almost as if it's like, I can't believe you made it out.
Nearly 40% of Brownsville lives in poverty. And if you look at the Opportunity Atlas and zoom into Brownsville, a lot of it is exactly what you'd expect. Black kids raised in the area 30-some years ago now make about $17,000 a year, same as their parents. But once you head across Dumont Avenue, everything changes. Black kids from the same exact background are doing better than their parents, making around $26,000 a year.
And I think what's interesting is that when you look at that national map, right, you see places like Charlotte and Atlanta with much lower rates of upward mobility, right? In terms of policy, it's probably not super helpful to say, hey, the mayor of Charlotte, you should be more like North Dakota. If you just took their secret sauce, you could really fix all of your problems. But when we're able to really get at these granular levels and seeing differences in the same neighborhood just across city streets, I think it starts to give us more insight into what's actually happening on the ground in our communities.
In the 80s, New York City had been hard hit by a recession. Then the crack and HIV epidemics. There was a part of Brownsville that was totally abandoned, the other side of Dumont. The New York City government sold over 16 square blocks of Brownsville to the East Brooklyn congregations for $1. Those blocks were dilapidated, run down. The city agreed to build infrastructure and provide cash subsidies for over 1,000 affordable homes. They would start selling at $30,000 each. They were called Nehemiah houses, after the man in the Bible who rebuilt parts of Jerusalem.
The family was growing, and we needed something that was much better for the children. I didn't like elevators, up and down the elevators for my children, because it was a lot of people living in the housing projects.
Audra Palacio was 6 when they bought the house.
I remember when we moved into the Nehemiahs. We were so excited. We had rooms, we had space, we had our backyard.
Here's Reverend Brawley. He says the Nehemiah houses in Brooklyn gave children a space to do homework, a good night's sleep.
When people have ownership of their properties, ownership of their community, you have a better chance of addressing all core issues, such as education and quality of life.
After I leave the family, I walk just a few blocks to Dumont Avenue. According to the atlas, it's the dividing line. On the map, it looks jarring, but in person, it's completely unspectacular. People bustle on their way to work, cars zoom by. Just another New York City street. It means nothing. But what side you're on means everything. Jasmine Garst, NPR News, New York.
So I thought it'd be helpful to give a little New York flavor while everyone's here in New York. But so again, I think we found it really striking to be able to see the differences within place and to start thinking around what's happening in our communities, in our neighborhoods, that creates good and bad outcomes, or better and worse outcomes, and how can we apply that to policy. But one question though, and we are a research lab, so we're looking at causal impact. Oftentimes there's the assumption that people do differently in different neighborhoods because certain kinds of people are moving to those places. It's not really about the impact of that place on those families and those children. So what we do to test that out, we actually kind of quasi-experimental work looking at families who moved across the country, millions of families that moved across communities. And so using the example of the Nehemiah houses area versus the neighborhood across the street in Brownsville, those families they mentioned who grew up in the Nehemiah houses, those kids grew up to earn around $26,000, whereas their friends across the street on average grew up to earn around $17,000. And what we see is that for a kid who moved from Brownsville to Nehemiah homes at age 2, they on average earn around $25,000, almost as much as that child who grew up their entire lives in Nehemiah homes. But every year that move took later, we see a difference in outcomes until your early 20s. So we're seeing that it looks like total exposure to a place has real impact. And it's so interesting in the data, what we actually see even within the same families. Right? So if there's a family that makes that similar move, that younger sibling that had more exposure to a place like Nehemiah houses, on average has better outcomes than their older sibling that had less exposure. So it really speaks to not just who's moving and the characteristics of those families, but the causal impact of place on those families. And I think it really speaks to the potential to have real impact. Right? I think neighborhoods matter, but also the programs and supports that we provide for our young folks matter as well. So I think it's not just about moving, but I think it really shows the ability to impact the life trajectory in very tangible ways that we can actually measure in the long term with data. So we do a wide range of research on education and school quality, on higher education, place-based revitalization. But today I wanted to focus on one particular line of work that I think shows one potential pathway to using research to pilot projects, to real policy, and potentially scaling that nationwide to have real transformative impact. And looking at how we reduce segregation and increase access to neighborhoods for families, especially low-income families. So, of course, I think as this crowd very well knows, housing stability is so essential for families and children. But I would challenge you to also think critically around how can we leverage housing policy most effectively to really create more upward mobility and opportunity? So we look at housing choice vouchers, Section 8 vouchers, and how they're used across the country, very important for millions of families in increasing housing stability. But overwhelmingly, families that use these vouchers end up in high poverty and low opportunity neighborhoods. So in some ways, this same policy is potentially exacerbating the same issues of discrimination, redlining, and housing segregation that I think have gotten us to this place in the first place. So what we did was, now that we have more evidence on the impact of place, thinking around how do we potentially decrease the barriers of access to these high opportunity places for low-income families. So talking with industry experts, folks in the housing authority space specifically, thinking around how do we leverage housing choice vouchers more effectively to not just increase housing stability, but also increase access to some of these higher opportunity places. So in collaboration with the Seattle and King County Housing Authority, we piloted a program called Creating Moves to Opportunity, where we provided services to families receiving housing choice vouchers, including housing navigators and counselors to help coach them through the rental application process and teach them about neighborhoods they may not be familiar with. We engaged directly with landlords to break down some of the stereotypes around low-income families using housing choice vouchers and bring down some of the red tape associated with the program. Then also provided short-term financial assistance to help on issues like security deposits and moving expenses. And the idea was, let's really test out if we can bring down some of these barriers, does this change the choices that families make when they're deciding where to move for themselves and their families? And what we saw was pretty dramatic. So typically in Seattle and King County, families who had housing choice vouchers, around 10% would usually use them or move to neighborhoods of higher opportunity, as shown in the data. For the families that didn't receive these extra services in this trial, around 14% ended up moving to these higher opportunity places. But for those families who received the housing counselors, where we engage with landlords and who received that flexible financial assistance, almost 4 times as many families moved to these higher opportunity places. And these are neighborhoods that in the data, we see that for the kids who grow up there, on average, they will likely earn over $200,000 more dollars in their lifetime. They're more likely to attend college, less likely to become teenage moms, and less likely to be incarcerated. So this is a fairly inexpensive intervention that is really helping empower families to make the best choice for themselves and their families. And it's hopefully kind of one tool in the toolbox to help us start to break down those barriers and start to think critically around how we can reduce segregation and integrate our communities. And one thing that I found especially heartening was that it was not just that the families were moving to one apartment building out in the boonies in King County, but we see these green dots represent where the families that received those services moved, and the areas in slightly darker blue are those areas of higher opportunity. And we're seeing that this intervention really expanded the geographic range where all these families move. So it really seems like this intervention that provided information and light touch support really gave families much more opportunity in terms of where they were deciding to live. Also, we were excited to see that in qualitative work that accompanied the pilot project, families who received those services were much more satisfied with the neighborhoods where they moved and seemed much more likely to stay in those same neighborhoods. And I think it's important to note that this chart is not just showing the families that moved to higher opportunity places, but just families that received those services in general. I think that's a key point, is that even if they're not moving to the places that the data show the kids will have better opportunity, I think this support, again, I feel like really empowers families so that they can make the best choice for themselves, whether or not it's in a place that the data shows is a higher opportunity place, right? Some families, they might have a really strong church network, they may speak a certain language, so certain communities, even if the data doesn't show it, might be the best for them, and making sure that they're able to make that choice with as much information as possible, I think is really central to this program. And so with the success of that pilot, given that we're researchers, we want to make sure that this isn't just unique to Seattle, that a similar kind of intervention could work in a much broader range of communities. So we're working now to work with partner housing authorities to see if we can replicate this in a few more sites to create more proofs of concept to hopefully change the narrative at the national level build more support for housing choice vouchers and the support services to make sure that families who use them are using them in the most effective way possible. And what's also exciting is that given today's atmosphere in Washington, there's usually not much consensus around anything. But shockingly, there was actually a bill last year, I think inspired by a lot of this research, the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, introduced by Senators Chris Van Hollen and Todd Young, one Democrat and one Republican. I was shocked too, actually some bipartisan work, but a bill that would create 500,000 additional vouchers, so 500,000 more families would be in stable housing. The families who qualify, families that had a history of homelessness and housing instability, it would also provide supports like in Creating Moves to Opportunity that would support families and help them make the most empowered moves. So I think this is a real tangible way to, I think, one, again, start to reduce segregation, create more stable households, and really empower families in ways that the data literally shows us will have real tangible impacts on their long-term outcomes. I think this is a heartening example of when researchers and practitioners can come together to think of creative ways to do their work more effectively, actually test those interventions out to build the evidence base, I think can start to almost break that glass ceiling on some of the impasses that we see in Washington and with our federal policymakers. So I think I will stop there. Again, I'm not an expert in this space, so I'm happy to share a lot about our work, but I'm actually here to learn from you so we can inform our work and continue to think of creative ways to do all of our work more efficiently and more effectively. So I think we have some time for Q&A, but again, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Also very hesitant to have to use this, but do you get
Is this on? Oh, it's on. Well, start cranking those questions in your head. One observation I wanted to make, I love the data. I think it tells a fuller story of what's happening, especially at that very local level. But I found a lot of what David said resonates with a lot of things that Ralph said this morning, and about how it is a very layered and complex issue, and the real nexus of this is providing people with information, education, your time to start where they're at and move them forward in the best way possible. So this Community Residential Resource Center concept that Ralph talked about this morning, it's something that some of us can do immediately while at a more macro policy level, things are moving forward. So again, just sort of struck me. Anyway, I'll stop talking. So questions, where can I start? Oh, here we go. So before you ask your question, please give your name and your affiliation as well as where you're from.
Thank you. Jen Paddock from Seattle, Washington. I'm from an organization called Acres of Diamonds. So just a quick question. I got really excited when I saw us up there, but I know intimately those areas of opportunity you were mentioning, and the first thing that I think popped into several of our heads was, so if these families are given vouchers and they're in these areas of opportunity, that's awesome. But what happens when the voucher runs out? Because we know the rents in those areas and they are not affordable. So that is a little disconnect for us. And I don't know if you would be the one to ask that question of, but that's my question.
No, I think that's my job, so I will try and answer that.
Okay.
So a few points. So I think one piece about vouchers is that they're not time limited. So like families do kind of move out of the voucher system, but there's not a discrete time limit on them. So I think they are a resource that is actually, for the families that get them, they generally get to use them for a pretty significant amount of time. I think the one thing that the research team found really interesting was that when you look at, and I think again it's different for different places, but I think oftentimes there's the assumption that neighborhoods of higher opportunity will be just by default much more expensive. And in a lot of cases we do see that, but we also see a lot of neighborhoods where the outcomes are better for low-income kids and they're relatively affordable. So interestingly, actually in Seattle, before our pilot program, they implemented a tiered system where you were able to pay more for rent. So it would encourage people to be able to move to some of these higher rent places. And what we saw is that families did start moving to some of these more expensive places, but they actually weren't necessarily moving to places of higher opportunity. So they were actually paying, so the vouchers had to allocate more for those rents, but they weren't necessarily in places where the kids who grow up there, especially the low-income kids, had better outcomes. So I think by being able to target not based on just area median income or poverty rates or rent rates, but actually look at the places that tangibly impact kids in a certain way, I think it actually creates opportunities to be more cost effective in some of our work in general. But so I think, of course, affordability is an issue, but I think that's why the voucher piece where you're paying 1/3 of your income actually can help you move to some of these higher expense places, but also we can target it more effectively to not necessarily just be paying more rent, but actually focus on, I think, the outcomes we want as well. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try, I'm not going to throw it that far, but. Try me? I'm going to come to you, ma'am. Again, if you could identify yourself, your agency, and where you're from, and then I'm going to have you toss it over here.
My voice is pretty loud, so I really pretty much may not need this. My name is Jeanette Wright, and I actually work with students in temporary housing. That was my question as far as to how long the vouchers would last, because my experience is that a lot of the higher levels of where you will talk about where families could move to, far too often the landlord is not even going to look at them. That's one. It made me lose my train of thought. Did you do this as a test pilot, though, in New York? Because, see, you know, Seattle is one type of population, but New York is a whole different entity. So I would like to see that the vouchers would last a period of time, but enough time for the families to be able to become stabilized mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, to know how to maintain that stability. So I'm curious as to how this is actually going to work in New York, because far too often a lot of our parents, from what I see, are turned away, and a lot of the vouchers that have been involved in New York, a lot of the landlords don't even want. So I'm curious to see you know, how this test pilot is going to run.
No, absolutely, and that's a key issue. And I think, so part of the test was because I think there's a narrative that the patterns of segregation we see, part of that might be housing discrimination, but part of it might be people's preferences as well. So part of the intervention was to test that out. And I think the fact that we see that those families who didn't receive that support and where there wasn't landlord engagement, right, those families didn't generally have the opportunity to move to these places. So I think that backs up your point that landlord discrimination and a myriad other barriers really do face these families when they're looking to move to different places. And there are different jurisdictions that have laws against discrimination of Section 8 voucher holders, but how strongly those are enforced, if people actually abide by those, is a very real question, which I think we need to do more studies on. But at least we find it heartening that through this support, through the landlord engagement, through some of that financial assistance, I'm sure there are still landlords who are discriminating, but it looks like we're able to find enough landlords, at least in this pilot, where those families who are looking for units are able to find them in these places. And I think your point about New York looks very different than Seattle, looks very different than Detroit, looks very different than Charlotte. And so the next step is to think around how do we adapt and adjust these types of programs for different circumstances? Because I think you're right. If it just works in Seattle, that isn't all of a sudden a national model. So how do we create enough proof of concepts? How do we figure out what the adaptations are for different markets to see if this really could be something that could work at scale and be transformational? So I think your points are exactly on point, and that's why we're trying to test this out more and more in other places. But again, the one good thing is that, again, vouchers are funded by the federal government, and they're not time limited, right? So I think it is a different kind of tool that once you have that voucher, that can keep you in that neighborhood. And also, we're going to test persistence rates as well to make sure that those families who are in these high opportunity places, that they're not all of a sudden moving back or don't have an opportunity to stay in those units as well. So that's a very important follow-up in the research we're doing. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your for your presentation. It was really incredible. My name's Jessica. I'm a social worker who works out in the Bronx at a hospital. So what I'm really curious about is looking at the Brownsville example and how, you know, being from New York City, I know Brownsville to be a diverse community, and also, of course, it's literally across the street. There was just a difference of $10,000. So I'm just curious, like, what was it that made that huge difference? Do you think it was education, or was it just literally not having stacked living, having actual space where the community could play, maybe their connection to that spiritual community, the church that helped? I don't know if they gave them, like, what was it? You know, I don't know if they gave them, like, financial literacy, like, I don't know if your study has looked into that, so I'm just curious around that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that's at a lot of the core of some of our ongoing work, but it also points out the limitations of our work as well, right? You know, we don't necessarily know exactly what's happening in every community that creates these outcomes. So one thing we do see nationally, there are a few factors that are highly correlated with some of these higher opportunity places. So one, it is poverty rate, right? So communities that are more socioeconomically integrated, generally the lower income kids who grow up there, have better outcomes. Interestingly, and this can be controversial depending on how you look at it, the one factor we see most highly correlated with upward mobility is the share of two-parent households in a community. So I think you can probably look at that very different ways depending on your ideological perspective. But one thing that I found interesting is that, so not only two-parent household share, but we see specifically in communities that have more Black fathers present, all of the young Black men, regardless of their own family circumstance, end up having better outcomes on average. And kind of similarly, we see that the location or proximity of jobs doesn't seem that highly correlated with economic opportunity, but the proportion of employed people in your neighborhood with a career or with a job is correlated. So I think it speaks to, in some sense, exposure, right? So being able to see people that you can relate to, that show you pathways through school, into college, into stable careers, that seems to have a real impact. And we have some other research that speaks to the importance of networks and social capital as well. So it's definitely not the only thing, but I think that neighborhood environment seems to have a real tangible impact. And so I'm not an expert on Brownsville, but I think those are the right questions, right? Church networks, the community cohesion, schools, especially schools that support low-income kids, are especially important as well. But I think it's a range of factors, but place definitely seems to have an impact. But I think that's part of our next step, is engaging with folks in place to use the data to pinpoint some of these interesting outcomes and getting their perspective on what's happening there.
Thank you. My name is Bill McLennan. I'm with Paul's Place in Baltimore. And my question also tied to Brownsville. While $10,000 is a significant increase, it's still below the poverty level. And so how should we interpret that? Was there a percentage of people that actually were higher and broke the barrier and actually are not on assistance?
Yeah, so that's the average outcome. So generally in most places, it'll be a bell curve, right? So there will be people who are making less, people who are making more, but on average for the kids who grew up in that neighborhood, in low-income families, those are their earnings by the time they're in their mid-30s. And so I think to your point, it shows that there's a real difference between these places, but we also have a ways to go for those kids who are only making $26,000 in adulthood as well. And I think interestingly as well, so those outcomes, we were specifically looking at outcomes for the Black kids who are growing up in Brownsville. And so one thing we see, again, I mentioned it with the chart looking at Black and white outcomes, but basically within every community, every neighborhood, you see a similar differential between Black and white men, literally who grew up on the same block. So I think it points to, one, the differences in neighborhoods, but it also shows there's a long way to go to support all the low-income kids, even in some of the best neighborhoods in terms of outcomes.
Hi, my name's Brian. I'm with the Pittsburgh organization called the Homeless Children's Education Fund. And I was wondering, so as you're providing these vouchers to allow people to move, from low opportunity areas to higher opportunity areas, the lower opportunity areas are still remaining just as low opportunity. And I wonder, I know you have like the 3 pillars of, and you have some community investment structures, that sort of thing, but I wonder, I don't have like a really clear question in my head for this, but like from a big picture scale, just that it doesn't seem to be fixing the or one of the fundamental issues if you're prioritizing. So I guess, yeah, how are you prioritizing who's getting the chance to move to these higher opportunity areas? Is it families with young children? And how, I guess, does the program see their responsibility for like changes in neighborhood makeup that results from those moves to and from different? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think the overall point
Could
is,
I just add to his question? I'm going to take. I've got it. Who are the people who are at the table or must be at the table from the perspective of government, not just the community? Structurally, how is this going to change? So if you could just expound on that.
Yeah. No, I think in that additional point is helpful because the core issue is these things have to work in tandem, right? Just housing vouchers and housing mobility is not going to fix all of our problems, right? But I think it is one tool that in a larger cohesive policy-making ecosystem, let's say, I think can be very effective. And so like the way I think about it, and it's interesting because I think we're so used to, and the data shows that it's unfortunately the reality, we're so used to, there are poor, bad places and rich, good places. Right? I think in an ideal world, we're creating affordable housing and affordable housing opportunity in a way that kind of creates normal places that have some poor people, have some middle income people, have some rich people actually living in the same neighborhoods. But that's become so non-normal in our country, I think it's almost hard to envision that, right? So I think, one, this type of voucher program, again, I think it empowers families, right? So there might be families who, they're living in a place that might be red on the map, but that's where their family is, right? They have a great network, and actually that community is the best for them. Whereas maybe someone who has, a young, an 8th grade kid, and they know that if they stay in the neighborhood, they're going to get involved in gangs and violence, so they need to go to the bluest suburban neighborhood possible, right? So I think at its core, it's a bit of a justice issue, right? I think all families, I know my family had the choice of where they wanted to live. I think all families should have the choice of the community that's best for them. And I think making sure that there are as few barriers as possible to making those choices. But then similarly, I think how do we reinvest in neighborhoods that have been disinvested in for the past 50 years? How do we make sure that families that want to stay there have the opportunity to have access to high quality education? But how do we also attract more middle income and high income families in ways that contribute to the community, in ways where they can actually interact and create a cohesive community, and in ways that make sure the families who are there get to stay there as well, right? So I think at its core, it's how do we desegregate, but also really integrate our communities in a way that I think makes them better for everyone. So I think all these things have to work together, and I think, to your point, Aurora, the housing authority with the local city housing department, with the state government to enact laws that reduce discrimination, I think all these parties have to come together to think around these issues holistically. And I think even beyond the neighborhood and city level, how do we think about it at a regional level as well? Because a lot of the disparity we see will be between city and suburb. So I think, I think your point is well stated that these things, there's no silver bullet. I think this is a pretty interesting, scalable policy, but it has to also be translated in a more holistic sense at the local level too.
Okay, hi. My name is Derek Lambert. I work with Share Our Strength and support our No Kid Hungry campaign, which is working to address child hunger through primarily through federally funded child nutrition programs, working with partners around the country. David, thank you so much. This is really interesting. And I have a quick question about one of the other pillars that you guys focus on, which is the place-based interventions. I'm really curious what similarities and differences you may have noticed in indicators for social mobility across different community types, specifically urban, suburban, and rural. Thank you.
Interesting. So one point on that is that I think we oftentimes talk around the urban-rural divide, right? And how there's maybe the assumption that urban places have more resources and they're just better than rural places, or there's some narrative around that divide. One thing that I found interesting in the data is that some of the highest opportunity places are rural areas in places like North Dakota, in Iowa, in some of these rural communities. And actually their lower mobility places are certain pockets of their urban centers. Whereas in the Southeast, the rural areas there are probably the areas of lowest opportunity throughout the country. So it kind of adds some nuance to, it's not just rural versus urban, but actually what's happening specifically geographically in these different places. And I imagine it has a lot to do with with history and kind of how those places came about. But I think it does add some nuance to what's happening there. I think kind of that's one example that we've seen, is that, you know, rural looks very different in different parts of the country as well as urban also. So I think that's one example. And again, I think a lot of those factors that I mentioned earlier are some of the core ones that we see in the data, but also we're limited too, right? Because we're using national data sets where we're not able to dive in and kind of do the statistically rigorous things that we can to see every difference in communities. But I think that rural divide was one that particularly stuck out to me. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Stella Hughes, and I work for the Urban Resource Institute. We're located in New York City. I just wanted to kind of like go back where you mentioned about the strengths of Black families include the father, you know, where the homes where there's fathers in the homes, they tend to be more successful. The children tend to have better outcomes. Because it reminded me of mass incarceration. And I just didn't want us to, you know, like mention that and like just go over to something else, because that's a cultural issue and inbreeds the separation of two-parent households in the Black community.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important, and kind of similar to some of the trends we see between Black men and white men in terms of long-term outcomes. We see similar trends in terms of incarceration, right? Where even Black men coming from high-income families have almost the same incarceration rate as white men coming from low-income families. And one thing to note about the stat for Black fathers, so it's not just about the father in the household, but literally the fathers in the community, which I think again is maybe heartening, right? So that it's not, like, you know, even if you don't have a father figure in your own house, of course that's very helpful and very powerful. But again, exposure to mentors in your community seems to also play a big role. And I think that speaks to, you know, our different types of programming, right? You know, how do we create those mentors, those role models? How do we create exposure to those pathways to stable adulthood? So I think the household is super important, but I think the data also shows that the broader community, which again is impacted by mass incarceration, has a huge impact as well.
Can anybody who has a question raise their hand? Because I feel like I'm paying attention to the back of the room a lot, and I want to make sure I see something. Okay, I'm going to migrate over this way. I'm going to come this way. But I also want to say to my colleagues at the Institute, we did a piece that David mentioned on Brownsville, and in addition to all the data that talks about, oh my, there's a lot of work to do here, we also did highlight some of the solutions that are in play right now as we speak there in Brownsville. So somebody from the Institute, I'd love for you to raise your hand, because I'm going to come to you and make you talk about it. So get ready, get your nerve up. But let me just start making my way this way.
Hi, I'm Ellen Carter. I'm a social worker with York Housing Authority in York, Pennsylvania. I'm concerned we have a small development with 30 units. We are hoping to get a grant so that we can, they were built in 1954, but so that we can tear them down, and the only thing you can build now, evidently, is tax credit housing. We're giving our people an option of either a priority of getting into another housing authority development that we have, or a Section 8 voucher with the accommodation of increasing the amount that we pay, so that, as our executive director believes, and I do too, so that people can move out of the inner city on their Section 8 voucher. I'm thinking, I've read some things about the community's initiative, and we wouldn't have applied for that grant. And as you showed, who got those grants for moving to work. Anyway, moving to opportunities. But anyway, my question is, for my little group of 30, I know that there's legislation, a bill being discussed now to change the burden of proof of discrimination from the landlord saying, I'm not discriminating, to the prospective tenant having to prove that he's discriminating. When that flips over, if that flips over to that direction, that's really bad news, because right now, all we have to offer that I can see is, hey, you know, if you, landlord, if you are going to pick and choose who you are going to rent to, there could be some problems for you. I don't know. We don't have the money to hire a housing navigator, but we may be able to get one through the county. So I see the consortium or the coalition forming a little bit. But what can the people who don't get a grant like this, what little things can I do for my 30 units? Those who elect to move out on a Section 8 voucher. What can I do to make this move out of the inner city into a more positive school district? We'll look at it from that piece of opportunity. That's my question.
Oh, thank you. So I think, one, you highlight the discrimination issue, which I think is a difficult one, and I think, frankly, there needs to be more study to see how do we actually make sure that those kind of laws or regulations are effective in decreasing discrimination in the housing market. But I think, and would love to touch base afterwards too, but again, I think even if you can't, or if you're able to, great, hiring a housing navigator, but just finding ways to help inform the moves that those families are making, or helping empower them to figure out what's best for them, right? So it's maybe using the Opportunity Atlas, having information around different neighborhoods, but also having information around those other tax credit properties too, because maybe those might be really good options for them as well. So I think one lesson is the power of information. Of course, there are very real barriers, but at least at a minimum, making sure that those families are aware of all the options open to them, which could be a housing navigator, could be someone on your staff as well. But I think we'd love to also touch base afterwards if you have more questions on that front.
Hi, I'm Kathy Desmond from People's Emergency Center in Philadelphia. Would you talk more about how you defined those high opportunity neighborhoods, and if you had any additional data on what families may have made use of what opportunities in those neighborhoods?
Yeah, so the way we define opportunity, it's using an outcome-based measure. So it's not based on the poverty rate, it's not based on how much the rent costs or the median income, but it's looking at, for those kids who grew up there, and specifically it's looking at kids who grew up there in the 80s, on average, what are the outcomes? What were the earnings of those children who grew up in that neighborhood? So the way we define opportunity is defined specifically by how the kids who grew up there, what their outcomes were. But I think importantly, when we're actually using it for policymaking, we take our measure, we take the data that you can see on the Atlas, and then work with those local practitioners. Say, hey, here's what our data says. What are you seeing on the ground? Where are there neighborhoods that have changed so tremendously that this measure probably needs to be updated? And then we make adjustments with those local practitioners who we'll work with on the ground. And then the housing navigators, will look and see what are the amenities that probably matter most to families. So when you're talking to a family, you can say, hey, here are these opportunity areas, but if you don't have a car, you probably don't want to move to this place because there's no transportation. Or if you really are focused, if you have really young kids, you want to make sure there's a great preschool there. So I think we use our core measure that's based on outcomes, and then we work with our local partners to figure out then what's needed based on this particular type of programming. And I think especially in Seattle, so interestingly, so a lot of this work is also premised on some research we did called Moving to Opportunity, which is in the mid-90s, public housing projects were torn down in, I think, 4 or 5 different cities, and families were given vouchers to move. And a lot of those families, they were trying to move to safer areas. Their main concern was crime. In Seattle, I think what we saw was most of the concern was about schools, right? So it wasn't like downtown Chicago where crime was the main issue, but here it was families that were looking for better schools. So I think both pairing the outcome data with information about school and school opportunities seem to be super helpful for our families.
Hi, Donna Anderson. I work at the City University of New York here in downtown Brooklyn on early childhood issues. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you. It's really nice to see mapping software used for good and not just like congressional redistricting. So that was really awesome. But I also was thinking about the impacts. You know, there's been a lot of research about how diverse schools are good for every kid and not just kids in lower income families. And if your research is looking at all at the impacts of what people are bringing to those high opportunity communities when they're coming in, and how can you use that to sort of sell this idea, you know, and sort of, I think about combating NIMBYism and really kind of addressing the other side and the real positives that those kids are bringing to those new schools and those families are bringing to those neighborhoods.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. And NIMBYism is obviously plays a part here. I think it plays a bit of a smaller part when we're talking about vouchers as individual families. But I was in Washington, D.C. a little bit before the holiday, and they're thinking around kind of housing development policies and really making sure there's an equitable distribution of affordable housing throughout the district and all the different wards. And I think it doesn't get at your point specifically, but I think when you're not talking just about units and saying we need to build more low-income units in your neighborhood just because we need more housing generally, but I think the point about this actually increases opportunity for all of our kids, I think definitely resonates. I think we don't have as much information around the impact on the middle income and high income kids, and if that changed, I think we don't really see an impact there. But I think that's where that narrative shift comes into place. I think even if we don't have definitive data about the impacts, I think just having the stories of families, talking to folks in neighborhoods, and seeing the benefits of having mixed income communities and people interacting across class and race lines, I think that's a very important part of the story that, you know, our data isn't perfectly positioned to tell that story, but I think we're happy to work with folks who can help share that story as well.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more. Where's my Brave Institute person who's gonna? I see her getting up. Oh. The thing she likes least. This is my chief policy strategist. She's the one who likes to be out in front least. See, she's brave.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, my name is Andrea. I'm the Chief of Policy and Research at the Institute. When we work at the Brownsville piece, we found it very interesting at the other side of DuPont Avenue there's a big congregation of public housing and shelters. And we also spent a lot of time speaking to the community and to community activists in Brownsville. And they have a very active community. They're involved. In 2016 or 17, the city developed what's called the Brownsville Development Plan. So part of it is investing in developing vacant land to build affordable housing. Of course, the question that all the community activists had was where this housing is going to be really affordable for the families of Brownsville. But there's also an investment. I think the city is launching pre-K for all 3 years. There's an investment on youth programs, on safety, security, because violence. Brownsville also had high incarceration rates, high violence, has some of the highest violence rates in New York City. So what was really interesting about this neighborhood was that it was a congregation of all these factors, violence, mental health issues, public housing. So just kind of to add to the conversation on Brownsville.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it reminds me of conversations that we'd have in Detroit as well. In Detroit, again, looks very different than most places in the country, but we had so much vacancy that I think the assumption was there's room for everyone, right? We want to attract new middle-income families, new high-income families, really create mixed-income communities. But you know, families who've been in Detroit for a long time, even if they're not against new folks who are moving in, there's still well-warranted skepticism. I mean, they've been promised a lot of things for a very long time and haven't seen results. So even if it's beneficial to bring in families that have higher incomes and create a more integrated community, there is still that distrust. And I think something that I hope the data can do, and we're working on research on gentrification and some of the place-based work, but to really figure out what are the impacts of different shifts, both families when they move out and families when they move in, to at least have more informed conversations around what the impacts are on all those families so that we can hopefully kind of work through some of the rhetoric, because I think gentrification is always the main concern when you're talking around place-based revitalization. So how do we actually build community up, build more social cohesion in ways that lift up all the families, but guarantee the families who want to be there, who are dedicated to their communities, have the chance to stay there and really contribute as well. So we don't have all the answers to that, of course, and I think no one does right now, but I think we're hoping that the data can help inform those conversations, to have empowered conversation on how we improve all of our communities, including places like Brownsville.
Thank you.
I'm going to just take the last minute or so just to kind of wrap this up. Thank you, David, very much for this. As I said earlier, I love data. You show me a spreadsheet, you show me a graph, I'm like in love, right? But the reason I'm in love with it is because, to me, I see the story behind it. It is very important for all of you to talk to people who do this data work, because someone's got to hold our feet to the fire, right? It's not just numbers for numbers' sake. I'm going to give you a very concrete example. Last night I had a conversation with Jean. Where are you, Jean, from Arkansas? Are you here?
You wasn't Jean. She probably left. How about Mary?
Someone from Arkansas. One of the homeless liaisons from Arkansas. And she was talking about how it's very difficult to get funding to come to a conference like this. And we started talking about what's going on in Arkansas. And in fact, we're doing a lot of work with some CDC data, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey data, and we've found some shocking numbers out of Arkansas. So what I said is, you know what? Invite the Institute to come and talk with you. Let us share the data, but let's have a real conversation about what's happening and why it's happening. So what I would encourage all of you to do, because we do data work, as does David, as do many organizations around the country, and we must have authentic conversations around the numbers, because the numbers are powerful, but they're not powerful in and of themselves. They're powerful because there are real stories behind them. So again, please invite us, talk to, like people like David who can maybe be a resource for all of you. And throughout the next session this afternoon and the sessions tomorrow, please make those contacts. I strongly encourage you to do that. So we have until about 2:45 when the next session starts. I've been told the Girl Scout cookies are all out there. So please indulge. And we will see you back here at 4:30 for the cocktail reception and awards ceremony. Thank you so very much.